This is related to the reading that we did in the Blugold guide, okay, called An Overview of Rhetoric. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint, which I typically don't do, but I'm going to use that so that we can go through the key terms and the key ideas in this lengthy but important reading, okay? All right, so we worked with the definition of rhetoric earlier in the term, but just to reiterate, the way in which Robert Herrick defines rhetoric is a systematic study and intentional practice of effective symbolic expression. This is on page 46 in the Blugold guide. And the things that we want to keep in mind with this definition, or we want to be aware of what this definition brings to our attention, is three different things. One, rhetoric is about systematic study. This is what you have been doing for the ethos paper and the pathos paper. You have been systematically studying someone else's language. Okay? So it's both the study of other people's symbolic expression and the intentional practice of good and effective language use. That's what you're going to be doing later in the term, and that's what you do when you craft your own papers. You intentionally practice rhetorical principles, okay? And third, to draw out of this, is the idea of effective, that rhetoric is all about effectiveness, and effectiveness is determined by audience and purpose. Did the rhetor do what he or she set out to do? Okay, that is the basis for effectiveness. Rhetoric is a universal and architectonic art. So what he means by that is it's universal in that it pertains to pretty much everything. Rhetoric is very, very large in its scope of what it covers, what it relates to, what it does in the world. It's almost nearly universal in that it touches every aspect of our lives. We're learning about rhetoric in a school setting, in an academic setting, but rhetoric isn't just about writing papers in school. Rhetoric has to do with how you function in your daily lives. Rhetoric is how we get along as communities, societies, and groups of people. Okay? So it is universal to sort of the human existence. It is what we do. It's architectonic, and what he means by that is that rhetoric structures other things. It's sort of the architecture for other things. It's kind of like a foundation upon which other things are built. Rhetoric structures how we know what we know. Rhetoric structures how we learn. Rhetoric structures how disciplines organize their information. Rhetoric structures many, many things in our lives. So that's what he means when he says it's universal and architectonic. This is really important to keep in mind. Rhetoric is not synonymous with persuasion. They are similar, they are related. Persuasion is a big piece of that pie, but they are not one and the same thing. So that's very important to keep in mind. And then finally, Herrick makes the point that not all communication is rhetoric. So much of our communication, written, spoken, symbolic, is rhetorical, but not all communication is rhetoric. So given this caveat that not all communication is rhetoric, what he's trying to figure out, give you an answer to is, then how do we know what rhetoric is? How do we begin to make distinctions between this is rhetorical, but this isn't? This might be rhetorical, but this definitely isn't. How do we begin to make those determinations? If it's huge, but it's not everything. And so what he's going to offer us is 6 defining characteristics. There are 6 things that make communication rhetorical. Okay? If if the communication, oral, written, or symbolic, has one or more of these characteristics, it's within the realm of rhetoric. Okay, first one, rhetoric is planned. Okay, we know this. Rhetors, writers, speakers, make deliberate choices about language use. We have talked the entire semester, and part of what has been emphasized in the preface to the Blugold Guide, and really the preface for this whole course, is that writing is about choices. You as a writer need to make choices, deliberate, effective choices. As a reader, you need to understand the choices that other writers have made. That's critical reading. So rhetoric is planned. So if something is very deliberate and intentional, it's within the realm of rhetoric. Rhetorical communication is carefully, the technical term is invention, but rhetorical communication is very carefully created. It's very carefully arranged. It's that work that writers do and speakers do to say, should I put this example first or this example? Should I put this paragraph before this one, or should it come after? It's all of the piecing together, okay? And there's intentionality behind that. It's not random. It shouldn't ever be random. And part of what we do as rhetoric scholars and effective rhetoricians ourselves is to understand these things. So rhetoric is adapted to an audience. So we talked briefly about this when we defined audience earlier in the semester, but it doesn't have to be like a real audience, like a class or a group of people sitting down listening to a speech. It can be an imaginary audience, okay? And rhetors have to imagine someone. They have to imagine some group of people or some individual, because that is how they make choices. So when you write for your teacher, you're imagining what I want, what I would see as plausible, what I might accept. And that's part of the difficulty in writing for school, is you feel like it's very difficult to imagine what your teacher wants. Or it can be a very clear, real audience. We also talked last time or previously about this idea that there can be multiple audiences. So communication, discourse, writing, speaking can have a primary, clear, direct audience. It can have secondary and tertiary audiences as well. There can be many, many different kinds of audiences. Sometimes what's interesting about this is that rhetors can be saying two different things to two different groups of people. So take, for example, slave songs from 18th and 19th century America during the slavery era. Those are rhetorical discourse. To one audience, say white slave owners, it's, we're singing in the fields passing time. The message to the secondary audience, each other, is, we're going to meet out in the woods for church late tonight. Okay, so you can have different messages for different audiences. And then this is this idea about that what rhetoric does is it forges links between the rhetor's views and those of an audience. This means attending to an audience's values, experiences, social status, aspirations. Okay. Third, rhetoric reveals human motives. So this is sometimes a little bit abstract, a little bit difficult to understand. So people use rhetoric in response to their motives. All humans have motives. They have desires, they have goals, they have purposes, they have aims. We want things, okay? Sometimes we want abstract things, sometimes we want concrete things. But we use rhetoric to get the things we want or need, okay? So people use rhetoric in response to their motives. It can be our commitments, our sort of philosophy or ideology. It can be goals or desires, anything that can possibly lead to action. Rhetoric works best when the motives of the rhetor are aligned with the motives of the audience. And this gets to that idea that we were talking about last time and that some of you tackled in your papers, identification. So that when the motives of the rhetor are very much like, are sort of forged to be like those of the audience, you have identification. A bridge has been created. A conduit for persuasion has been created. So rhetoric is really interesting. One of the reasons that so many people study rhetoric is because of this. It reveals human motives. So we can learn a lot about cultures, societies in all parts of the world, all over time, by reading and understanding and systematically looking at their rhetoric, because it tells us what they valued. It tells us what they wanted. It tells a lot about the people who use rhetoric. So that's one reason why it's really interesting to study. We also talked about this before, but it's worth reiterating. So this idea that the fourth characteristic of rhetoric is that it's responsive. Rhetoric is response-making, which means there's an exigence. We talked with that term before. It prompts a rhetorical action or response. Something happens. So last year, Governor Walker passed or attempted to pass a budget repair bill. That was an exigence that called forth a response for many, many people to protest, to get on buses and go to Madison, to write letters, to email. So that was an exigence that prompted response. And rhetoric is response-making. We talked before about how it's also response-inviting. All of those protesters who were in Madison complaining or expressing a lot of skepticism about his budget repair bill wanted him to respond to them. They weren't just out there, just for the heck of it. They wanted to prompt a response in the governor or in the legislature. It doesn't always work, but rhetoric wants something back. It doesn't always get it, but it attempts to. So in this way, rhetoric is dialogic, like a dialogue. Someone starts, someone responds, then you respond to him, he responds to you. It's dialogic. And it's situated. We talked about rhetorical situations. Rhetoric is very situated. It's very context specific. Rhetoric makes sense and works within relationships, times, spaces, places, understandings. It's very situated. It's very highly contextual. So rhetoric is not equivalent to, is not synonymous with persuasion, but rhetoric does seek persuasion. Persuasion is a very common motive. We want to persuade someone to come with us, or to think like us, or to do something that we want them to do. It's not the only motive, but it's a very common motive. Okay, what Herrick talks about in this part is that rhetoric seeks to persuade in 4 ways. Rhetoric aims to persuade through argument, through reason. This is sort of your realm of a classical argument with claims, warrants, support, those kinds of things. Rhetoric also seeks to persuade through the primary appeals: ethos, credibility; pathos, emotional appeals; logos, which we will call, for now, it's not logic like mathematical logic, it's cultural logic. So logos isn't logic like a syllogism or like a geometrical, in geometry you have proofs. That's logic. The logic that works to persuade people in a rhetorical realm are cultural logics. They are customary ways of thinking. They are things that people think are logical, plausible, tenable. And so logos changes over time. Logos depends on culture, value, ideology. So rhetoric seeks to persuade through argument and reason, through the main appeals, through arrangement. Again, we talked about how arrangement has to do with the deliberate, planned nature of rhetoric. The order and structure to something can, in and of itself, have a lot of persuasive power. And then aesthetics. Eloquence can carry the day. Eloquence can move us to believe things and to want to do things that we might not have wanted to do before. We can be moved by beauty and emotional language and memorable uses of language. Okay, this is a very important part of understanding what rhetoric does and what it does in the world. Rhetoric addresses contingent issues. Contingent means possible, dependent on other factors. It's conditional. So if we talk about contingencies, those are things that may or may not make something happen. Okay? So contingent is possible, conditional. Herrick writes, it's the duty of rhetoric to deal with such matters as we deliberate upon. This is actually Aristotle. He's quoting Aristotle here. It's the duty of rhetoric to deal with such matters as we deliberate upon, and when the subjects of our deliberation present alternative possibilities. Okay, so what he's getting at here is that there are realms of issues that people are completely decided upon. There's no alternative way to understand it. Something like gravity is not contingent. It is what it is, it will always be what it is, and we understand what it is. But something like why slavery happened in America is a contingent issue, because people are still talking about it, researching it, understanding it, coming to new ways of getting at its complexities. Anything that a group of people, big or small, are still arguing about, are still debating, is a contingent issue, which basically is almost everything. It's not everything, but it's most things. So there are certainly some hard and fast facts about our material world. But even things in our material world are contingent. So say, for example, last year, they being astrophysicists and astronomers, decided that Pluto is no longer a planet. So you can take a fact, like you learned in school, that there are 9 planets, and here's the order, and here's the names, and here's what they look like. But then when there's new research that's presented, then you have to go back to the drawing table and say, it's actually not a planet. So even things that we take as hard and fast facts change over time. Think of the way that people used to think that the world was flat. That was not contingent, because everyone believed that the world was flat. So there was no disagreement about that until they brought in new information and said, I don't know about this, I don't think it's flat, and then it changes. So things become contingent, and rhetoric helps societies, people, human beings figure out contingent issues. Who should we believe? What should we do? What's a reasonable course of action? What's the right way to go? So that's why rhetoric is so important, because it deals with everything that we are not 100% certain about, which is a lot. We have to reason together to make decisions. We have to make informed decisions together about innumerable contingent issues. Abortion, highways, campaign finance reform, religion, everything. So much of what we have to do is figure out together what we're going to do as a group, as a state, as a school, as a country, as a people. And we have to reason through those things together. Rhetoric is how we do that. And we have to make decisions. Rhetoric helps us come to reasonable conclusions about contingent issues, because at the end of the day, the jury has to decide, is he innocent or guilty? That can't just go on undecided forever. You have to make a decision, a reasoned decision about laws, about policies, about things to do. And so rhetoric is very important because we can't always keep things in endless flux. Decisions have to be made, things have to be done, and rhetoric helps us understand together what the best course of action is.